Every empire that has ever feared something builds a calendar around it. The 9 empires of the Middle Reach built a 1,000-year one. They called it the Vigil, and it was not a holiday, and it was not a war, and it was not quite a religion, though it borrowed the furniture of all 3. It was a tax. It was a fleet. It was a date circled on the charts of every navigator from the Ilm Dominion to the Bel Septarchy, and every child in 900 inhabited systems learned it the way children learn the name of the thing that lives under the floor. The Vigil existed because of a ship. Not a fleet, not an empire. Not a species, though the species had been dealt with in its own way, in its own time, and its remnants swept into the labor lanes and the orbital yards and the mining rigs of 9 polite civilizations. One ship. They called it the Ossuary. There was exactly one clear image of it in the archives of the Middle Reach, and every schoolroom in the Ashun Conquered had a copy of it on the wall, and every copy had been retouched over 1,000 years, until the thing in the picture had stopped being a photograph and become a portrait of dread. It had been taken by a scout drone at the 9 Suns, in the 9th hour of the last battle of the Long War, by an operator who did not survive the 10th. It showed a hull. Only a hull. There was no scale in the frame, no moon, no world, nothing to measure it against, and that was part of why the image never stopped working on the nerves of the people who looked at it. It was simply a wall of dark metal filling the picture from edge to edge, curved like the flank of something breathing, and running across that wall in ordered rows were marks. White marks, thousands of them, tens of thousands, rows and rows and rows of small pale scratches carved into the armor, marching away into the dark at the edge of the image, and it was obvious to anyone who had ever kept a tally what they had to be. The dead, cut into the skin of the thing that had made them. That was why the Middle Reach called it the Ossuary. Not the human's name for it. No one in 9 empires had ever known the human's name for it, and by the time anyone thought to ask, the humans who might have answered were 300 years dead and their records were ash. But the Conquered did not need a name. The Conquered had a picture of a warship that kept score. 41 kilometers of dark armor, and every meter of it a headstone. At the 9 Suns, the Ossuary had broken the combined battle line of the old Conquered Grand Fleet in 11 hours. 409,000 crew of 9 species had died in that engagement. It was, by a factor that historians still argued about, the largest single loss of life in the history of organized violence in the Middle Reach, and it had been inflicted by one hull, and afterward. This was the part that mattered. This was the part that built the Vigil. This was the part that no government in 1,000 years had ever been able to let go of. Afterward, the thing had turned away. It had not pressed the attack. It had not come to Ashun, which lay open behind the broken fleet with 4 billion souls on it, and no shield left worth the name. It had turned in the wreckage and the flare of 9 burning suns, and it had gone out into the dark, past the last charted marker, into the country beyond the edge of everything, and it had not been seen again. For 1,000 years. And the Middle Reach, which had been given its life back and did not understand why, decided, as frightened things decide, that it had not been given anything, that it had been left, that the monster had gone away to grow. So they built the Vigil. 31,000 hulls at permanent station in the Ashun Outer System, rotating on a 9-empire schedule, funded by a levy that appeared on the wage slip of every worker in the Reach under the line MEM. VIG. 900 years of it. Sensor arrays strung out to the heliopause like nets. Deep listening stations sunk into cold moons, staffed in shifts by people who spent their entire working lives waiting for one particular shape to resolve out of the dark, and who almost all retired without ever seeing anything but dust. And at the center of the Vigil, hanging in Ashun's high orbit like a knife balanced on its point, the Ember. 9 empires had built it together, which tells you what they thought of the thing they were building it for. It was the only weapon of its class ever assembled, a stellar-scale lance, a spear of ordered fire, capable, the modeling had always said, of unmaking any object in the volume of a star system in a single discharge. It had never been fired. It had cost more than the combined annual output of the Charon assembly. It was inspected daily. It was blessed monthly in 4 different faiths by people who did not otherwise speak to one another. It was the answer to a question that had been asked 1,000 years ago and never repeated. And on the morning the question came back, Sen Provost Vantesh was standing on a ceremonial dais in the coldest part of the year, listening to a choir sing about vigilance, and thinking, with the particular guilt of a woman who is very good at her job and no longer believes in it, that the whole thing was a magnificent and expensive lie. She was 94, which in her species was a woman entering the confident middle of her life. She was the ranking archivist officer of the Ashun Conquered, which meant she was the keeper of the vigil's records, which meant she had read more about the Ossuary than any living being, and it had left her with a splinter she could not work out from under the skin. The splinter was this: the numbers did not close. The Ossuary had killed 409,000 at the 9 suns. Terrible, documented, true. And then it had been 11 hours from Ashun, with the fleet gone, with 4 billion people below it and nothing between, and it had left. Every history in the Conquered explained this. They explained it beautifully. It had been damaged. It had been out of ammunition. It had been recalled. It had been afraid. It had been saving Ashun for later, for a slower and more artistic destruction, and later had simply never come. Vantesh had spent 40 years reading those explanations, and every one of them had the same quality, which was the quality of a man explaining, at great length and with many gestures, why he does not owe you money. She had once, as a junior, requested the sealed founder's file on the 9 suns. The request had come back stamped with a code she had to look up, and when she looked it up, it meant, "This material is withheld by standing order of the First Conquered, permanently, in the interest of public composure." Public composure. She had never forgotten the phrase. She had put in the request 11 more times across 4 decades, in 11 different ways, and had been refused 11 times, and had been promoted anyway, which told her something about how seriously anyone took her. The choir finished. Somebody handed her a bell. She was supposed to ring it. It was the 1,000th ringing. There would be a picture. And then the sky over the dais changed color, and every device on the field made the same sound at once, that flat, tearing alert tone that no civilian ever hears twice in a lifetime. And Vantesh, holding a ceremonial bell in her hand, watched 300,000 faces turn upward together like a field of grain in wind. Perimeter contact, outer buoy line. Beyond the orbit of the 9th planet, in the cold and the dust where nothing had come out of the dark for 1,000 years, something had come out of the dark. It was decelerating. That was the first detail, and it was the detail that broke the composure of the Vigil's watch officers before the mass reading even came in, because things that decelerate are not debris, and are not rogue comets, and are not sensor ghosts. Things that decelerate have somewhere they intend to be. The second detail was the mass. The duty officer at Station 4th Wall read it, and then read it again, and then did the thing they train you never to do, which is to reset the array to make sure it is not lying to you. And it was not lying to you. And when the number came back the same, he sat very still for 4 seconds and then transmitted it to 9 empires simultaneously without waiting for authorization, and was later commended for it. 211 billion tons. 41 kilometers. And the third detail arrived 9 minutes later, when the long optical array at Cold Mother swung around and got its first clean image, and the image went out on every band before anyone could think to stop it, and within an hour it had been seen by 900 billion people, and every single one of them recognized it, because every single one of them had grown up with it on a schoolroom wall. A wall of dark metal. And running across it, rows and rows and rows of small white marks. There is a particular sound a civilization makes when it discovers that the thing it has been frightened of was real. It is not a scream. It is quieter than that. It is the sound of 900 billion people going into their kitchens and standing there, not doing anything, while the light from a screen moves on the wall behind them. The Ashun conquered went a full mobilization in 22 minutes, which was 11 minutes faster than any drill had ever managed, and the 8 other empires followed within the hour, and by the end of the first day the standing answer, the Vigil's fleet, 31,000 hulls, 800 years of accumulated dread rendered in steel, had come off station and was forming a wall between the intruder and the world of Ashun. Not a picket, not a screen. A wall 4 light towers deep, every gun in it laid on one point in space. The Ember woke up. Its coolant plant, which had run at idle for 9 centuries, went a full draw, and the lights browned out in 3 cities on the day side of Ashun, and nobody complained. And on the 10th day of the approach in 900 systems, the other thing began. The humans. There were perhaps 60 million of them scattered through the middle reach, dockhands, hull scrapers, sump divers, the people who did the work that machines were too expensive to do and citizens were too proud to do. They lived in the lower rings and the wet levels. They had their own quarter in every port and their own word for it, and it was not a nice word. They were the descendants of a defeated species, and they had been told so, gently and constantly, for 30 generations, and most of them had made a kind of peace with it, and most of them had never in their lives said the word Ossuary out loud where a citizen could hear. They did not rise. That was the thing that afterward everybody found hardest to explain in all the reports and the inquiries and the long, careful books. They did not riot, they did not sabotage, they did not cheer. They went to work. But they stopped looking down. That was all. Across 60 million people in 900 systems, in the lower rings and the wet levels and the loading yards, human beings began, quietly, without organization, without a single meeting or a single leaflet, to walk with their heads up. And 9 empires, watching this, understood that they were afraid of something they did not have a name for. The conquered's response was drafted in a single night and enacted in a single morning. Curfew in the human quarters, registration, suspension of movement permits. On 4 worlds, the local governors went further, on their own authority, and the reports that came out of those 4 worlds were the sort of reports that get filed under a heading nobody reads until much later. Ihru Vantesh read them. She read all of them. She was the archivist, that was the job. She sat in her office in the deep stacks under the conquered hall, with the Vigil's 1,000 years stacked around her in racks that ran for kilometers, and she watched the approach telemetry tick down on a screen the size of her hand, and she read a report about a curfew enforcement action on a human labor moon in the Charon assembly that had left 41 dead, of whom 11 had been under the age of 9. And she put in the 12th request for the sealed founder's file. It was refused in under 4 minutes. She had never had one refused so fast. It was refused, she noticed, by an office that should not have been awake at that hour, and the refusal carried an appended line that had not appeared on any of the previous 11. Further application in this matter will be treated as a security event. Ihru Vantesh sat back in her chair. For 40 years she had believed she was chasing a hole in the history, a gap, an absence of the kind that archives are full of, the kind that means only that somebody was busy or careless or dead. You do not threaten a woman over an absence. You threaten her over a presence. Somewhere in the sealed stack beneath her feet, in a file that 9 centuries of conquered first ministers had refused to open, there was something, and it was not a gap, and the conquered had built a fleet and a weapon and a 1,000-year tax and a schoolroom picture on top of it. Outside, 41 kilometers of dark metal came on toward Ashun at a steady, patient, unhurried deceleration curve, and did not answer hails, and did not power weapons, and did not deviate, and every gun in the middle reach tracked it, and 900 billion people stood in their kitchens with the light moving on the wall behind them, and waited for the monster to speak. On the 22nd day, it did. The transmission came in on every band at once: military, civil, emergency, the old abandoned frequencies nobody had used in 600 years, the navigation carriers, the weather channels, the commercial music streams in 900 systems. It overrode everything. It was not encrypted. It was not coded. It did not use the diplomatic protocols of any of the 9 empires, because the diplomatic protocols of the 9 empires had been invented 400 years after the last human ship had spoken to anyone. It came in the conquered's own trade tongue, spoken slowly, clearly, and correctly, with the vowels a little long, the way a person speaks a language they have learned entirely from listening. And it was a boy's voice. That was the detail that went around the middle reach faster than the image had. Not a warlord, not a machine, not the grinding subsonic roar that 1,000 years of popular entertainment had taught 9 species to expect from the thing in the picture. A young man, 19 years old, though nobody out there could have known that yet. Voice a little rough at the edges from nerves, breath audible, the sound of someone standing too close to a microphone in a very quiet room. He said, "This is the human Dreadnought Marigold. This is not an attack. Our weapons are cold. Our launch bays are sealed. There are 30,000 people on this ship, and most of them are children or old, and we are asking," a pause, a swallow, clearly audible across 900 systems. "We are asking to speak to somebody. Please. We have been coming here for 11 years, and we have very little time left, and we are asking to speak to somebody." Silence on 900 worlds. And then, quieter, as if he had forgotten the microphone was open, as if he were speaking only to whoever in all that dark might be listening. "Please don't shoot. We came a long way to say sorry." The room Theodor Amsel was standing in had been designed, 1,000 years ago, to coordinate the fire of 211 main batteries. It was called the listening deck now. The gunplot tables were still there, because nobody on the Marigold threw anything away. You could not, out in the dark, where the nearest place to get a bolt was nowhere, and the nearest place to get a new one was never. But the tables had been repurposed a long time ago, and their surfaces were scratched and warm and covered in the accumulated debris of 40 generations of people whose entire job was to listen to a galaxy that hated them. Coffee rings, somebody's knitting. A child's drawing of a bird from a child who had never seen a bird, copied from a photograph of a bird taken on a planet that no longer had any. And the sound, always the sound. The listening deck ran 900 channels at once, at low volume, out of 41 speakers set into the old fire control alcoves, and the effect was of standing in the middle of a crowded market in a city that was 11 light years away and did not know you existed. Theo had been born in that noise. He had learned to speak in it. Before he had known what any of it meant, he had known its shapes. The flat, rapid clatter of Ilm commodity reports, the 4-part singing that meant a Bell funeral, the long, soft advertising drawl of the Charon leisure channels that had lulled half the children on the ship to sleep for 2 centuries. He knew the trade tongue of the Ashun conquered better than he knew the language his own grandmother had died speaking. He knew the words for grain futures and grief. He knew 900 systems worth of weather. He had never been outside. That was not a figure of speech. Theodor Amsel, 19 years old, apprentice of the listeners, had never in his life stood under an open sky, never felt whether that was not scheduled, never seen a horizon that was not a curve of decking rising away in front of him until it went up and became ceiling. He had lived his whole life inside a warship, and so had his mother, and so had her mother, and so on back through 40 generations of people who had been born and had loved and had quarreled, and had buried their dead inside the biggest machine the human species ever built, in the dark, in the long silence, running. They called it the long running. They did not call it exile. That was important to them in a way that took some explaining. The Marigold had been built to end a war. She was 41 kilometers of layered armor, and she had once carried a weapon that could reach into a star and pull, and there were still places in her deep hull, sealed and dark, where that weapon slept. She had been named for a flower, because in the year she was launched it was the custom of the shipwrights of Earth to name the great hulls after the things that grew in the gardens of the world they were meant to protect, on the theory, sentimental and true, that a crew fights better for a name it can picture. Nobody in the 9 empires had ever known that. Nobody in the 9 empires had ever seen a marigold. If they had, they would have found it a very odd thing to call a monster. The gardens were real, though. That was the part that would have surprised the Vigil most, if the Vigil could have walked her decks. Missile Bay 11 was wheat. It had been wheat for 600 years. The launch cradles had been cut out and melted down, and the deck had been terraced and lit, and there was a field in there. A real one, 40 meters across. And in the harvest week, the whole watch went in with hand scythes because the machines that used to do it had worn out 3 centuries ago, and nobody had ever managed to build new ones that worked. The forward magazine was orchard, apple mostly, some plum. The trees were small and stubborn and had adapted over 40 generations into something a botanist from Earth would have looked at with alarm. Bay 9 was bees. Bay 4 was the vault, and nobody went into the vault. And in the deep cold hollow at the ship's heart, where the ammunition for 211 main batteries had once been racked in its thousands, there was a lake, a real one, 180 meters of black water that the engineers used as a heat sink and the children used as a swimming hole, and the dead, in the end, went into, because a ship in the dark cannot afford to lose the mass. That was the Marigold, a warship that had spent 900 years slowly turning itself into a farm, crewed by the great-great-grandchildren of the people who had refused to fire it. And she was dying. Everybody knew. There had been no announcement, because on a ship where 3,000 people work in engineering, you do not need announcements. The containment lattice on the primary drive had been degrading for 80 years, and for 80 years the Wrights had been shoring it, splinting it, feeding it stripped-out material from decks they sealed and abandoned one by one. And about 11 years ago the last of the honest margins had run out, and the Wrights had gone to the captain and told her, in the flat, unhurried voice of people who have already cried about it in private, that the ship had somewhere between 11 and 14 years left in her before the lattice let go, and that, when it let go, there would be nothing left of the Marigold or anyone on her but a very bright light. 11 to 14 years, 30,000 people, and nowhere in all the dark to put them. They had voted. That too was the Marigold. Somewhere in the 4th or 5th century of the long running, the ship had quietly stopped being a naval vessel and started being a town, and towns vote. It had taken 9 months. Every deck argued it. Teo's grandmother, Octavia Amsel, who had been a listener before him, and who had spent 60 years with 900 alien channels running in her ears, had argued for it in the great hall of the listening deck, standing on a gun-plot table because she was small and wanted to be seen, and the recording of what she said was played on the ship's channel every year on the anniversary, and Teo could still hear the exact places where her voice had cracked. "They will shoot at us," she had said. "Of course they will shoot at us. We killed 400,000 of them and then we vanished, and a thing that vanishes becomes a god, and there is nothing in this universe that people will not do to a god they are frightened of. So they will shoot. And we will not shoot back because that is the entire point, because that has been the entire point for 900 years, and if we shoot back then everything our grandmothers did was only a delay, and some of us will die. And we will keep talking anyway, and we will tell them the truth, all of it, the ugly parts first, because the truth is the only thing we have left that is worth 11 light-years of fuel. The vote had carried by 411 votes out of 29,000. That was the other thing nobody in the Middle Reach would have believed. It had been close. It had been agonizingly, sleeplessly close, and there were people on this ship who had voted against it and who were still, on the 22nd day of the approach, quietly certain that they had been right, and who were standing their watches anyway, because that was what you did. The ship had turned. For the first time in 900 years, the Marigold had put her bow toward the light. 11 years of deceleration. Octavia Amsel had died in the 6th of them. Her ashes had gone into the lake, and Tio, who had been 14, had stood at the edge of 180 meters of black water under a ceiling of pipes and had thought, with a clarity that never afterward left him, that she had never seen the sky. That nobody here had ever seen the sky, that they were the only people in the whole galaxy who had to be told what rain was. Captain Sorrow Cole found him on the listening deck 4 hours before the transmission window. She was 56, and she wore no rank, because the Marigold had abandoned insignia in the 3rd century as a waste of thread, and everyone aboard knew who she was anyway. She was the 41st person to hold the office and the 11th to be elected to it, and she had spent the entire approach doing arithmetic that no one should have to do. How many hits the forward armor could absorb, and at what depth, and how many decks she could evacuate into the shadow of the ship's own bulk, and how many people that left in the compartments that could not be evacuated because that was where the people had to be to keep the ship alive. She had a list. It was 3,100 names long. Those were the people who could not be moved. They knew who they were. They had signed it. "You've been practicing," she said. Tio had. He had been practicing for 11 years. He had been chosen at 8, not by the captain, by the listeners, by old Ivo Wayland, who ran the deck and who had a genius for one narrow thing, which was hearing what a voice does to a stranger. Wayland had listened to 400 candidates and had picked a small, solemn boy with a chest infection, and when they asked him why, he had said, "Because when he talks, you want him to keep talking. That is the whole of it. That is a thing you cannot teach and cannot fake, and there is no ninth of it in the rest of them." So the ship had spent 11 years teaching Teodor Amsel to speak 9 languages perfectly, and to say one thing well. "They're going to be listening to a child," Tio said. He was looking at the plot, not at her. On the plot, the standing answer was a solid, unbroken smear of contacts, so many that the display had given up drawing them individually, and was drawing them as terrain, as a coastline, as something geological. 31,000 ships. Are they going to take a child seriously? "No," said Sorrow Cole. He looked at her then. "They are going to hear a child and they are going to think it is a trick," she said. "That is what a frightened person does with a kindness. They look for the wire. So they will look for the wire and they will not find it because there is no wire, and that will frighten them worse, and some of them will shoot." She said it without heat. She had been saying it in one form or another for 11 years. "And then they will keep listening. Because you are the only thing they have ever heard that came from inside the picture on the wall." She put her hand flat on the gunplot table, on 900 years of coffee rings. "They think we're a monster, Tio. They have to. They've paid for a monster for 1,000 years, the fleets, the levies, the school pictures. If we stop being a monster, somebody out there is going to have to explain what they spent it all on." She looked at the plot, at the terrain of guns. "That is the wall in front of us. It isn't the 31,000 ships. It's the invoice." Tio said, "So what do I say?" "The truth, ugly part first. Your grandmother was right about that, and she'd never forgive either of us if we got clever." "And if they fire?" Sorrow Cole was quiet for a moment. Behind them, 900 channels murmured about grain and weather, and a curfew in the lower rings of a labor moon. "Then you keep talking," she said, "and you do not stop, and you do not raise your voice, and you do not threaten them, not once, not even at the end, not even when it hurts. Especially not when it hurts. She straightened. That is the whole ship's honor, and it is in your mouth, and I am sorry. You should have had a childhood. I had one, Tio said. He had two. That was the thing that would have been hardest to explain to anyone out there in the terrain of guns. He had been a happy child. He had swum in the lake. He had stolen apples in Bay 4 and been caught by a woman who had made him eat 2 of them in front of her as a punishment. He had sat on his grandmother's lap in a room full of alien voices and learned to love them, the whole enormous quarrelsome market of them, all those people out there going about their lives, arguing about grain, burying their dead in 4-part harmony. He had grown up loving the people who were about to shoot him. That was not a tragedy to him. That was just what it was to be a listener. "Sit down," he said, surprising himself. "Please. I want you here." So the captain of the Marigold sat down on a gunplot table in a room full of knitting and coffee rings, and at 400 ships' time on the 22nd day, Theodor Amsel leaned in toward a microphone that had last been used to coordinate the fire of 211 main batteries, and opened every band in the middle reach, and told 900 billion strangers that his weapons were cold. The answer came back in 91 minutes, which was the light lag plus 4 seconds. 4 seconds. Somebody out there had had it written and ready and their finger over it. It was not a voice. It was a text carrier, machine-read into the trade tongue by a synthesizer that did not bother to sound alive, and it said, "Standing answer to unknown vessel. You are addressed under the Vigil Protocol, which is the only protocol that applies to you. You will hold position. You will vent your reaction mass. You will open every compartment of your hull to inspection by boarding parties of the 9. You will surrender the persons responsible for the 9 SUNS. Tio read it twice. "They know that's 1,000 years ago," he said. "They know everyone responsible for the 9 sons is dead." "They know," said Sorrow Cole. "Then what are they asking for?" "Somebody to hang," she said. "It's the oldest request in the galaxy. They'd like us to hand them a villain, because a villain is a thing you can finish." She stood and looked at the terrain of guns on the plot, and Tio watched her decide something, and he did not know yet that he would spend the rest of his life telling people about the way she looked when she decided it. "Send the log," she said. Old Ivo Whalen turned around from his console. "All of it." "All of it," said the captain of the Marigold. "The order, the refusal, the vote, the 9 sons, the whole butcher's bill. 900 years of it, uncut, in 9 languages, on every band they have." She pushed her hair back off her face with the flat of her hand, an ordinary tired gesture, and gave the first command any human being had given to the middle reach in 1,000 years. "Let them see us, all the way down." What the Marigold sent, at 6:11 ships' time on the 22nd day, was 11,000 hours of raw record. It was not a message. That was the first thing that unsettled the analysts of 9 empires. A message can be a trick. A message is built. This was an archive bridge audio, engineering logs, medical files, the minutes of 900 years of town meetings, the yield of a wheat harvest in the year that Ashun's 3rd dynasty fell. It was too big to be a lie. Lies are lean. This thing was fat with the sheer boring weight of people living. But at the head of it, flagged and indexed and translated into all 9 languages by a 19-year-old boy who had learned them from advertising jingles, was a single file that was 11 hours long, and it was the bridge record of the 9 sons. And 900 billion people sat down and listened to a dead woman. Her name was Sabine Hour. She had been 34 years old. She had commanded a warship the size of a mountain range for 11 months, which was, by the standard of that year, a long command, because the long war was in its last winter and captains did not last. Everything the Middle Reach thought it knew about the 9 sons was in the first 6 hours of that file, and all of it was true, and it was worse than the histories, because the histories had made it grand. It was not grand. It was a slaughter conducted at a range of 11 light seconds by people who were exhausted. The old conquered Grand Fleet had come to the Nine Suns to break Earth's last line, and Earth's last line was one ship, because Earth by then had nothing else. No yards, no reserves, no allies, 40 years of losing and a homeworld under a blockade that had already begun the slow work of killing its air. 1,100 conquered hulls against 41 kilometers of armor and 211 main batteries. And for 11 hours the Marigold stood in the gravity well of 9 burning stars and killed them. You could hear it. That was the horror of the file, and no historian in the Middle Reach had ever been able to convey it, because historians write in sentences, and what came out of the Marigold's bridge that day was not sentences. It was a woman's voice going flat and hoarse and mechanical, hour after hour, saying numbers. It was the gunnery officer weeping openly at his station and continuing to shoot. It was somebody in the 9th hour, saying quietly off mic, "Oh, oh, oh," in the tone of a person watching something they cannot stop. 409,000 dead, and on the Marigold, 11,000. The file did not soften it. The file did not contextualize it. Theodor Amsel had been given one instruction, ugly part first, and he had put 6 hours of it at the front of the archive, untouched, with nothing added, and let it run. And then came the 7th hour, and the 10th, and the 11th, and the Middle Reach heard the rest of it for the first time in 1,000 years. The conquered line broke at 21:40. What was left of it ran, and what was left of it was not much. And at 21:52, the Marigold's communications officer read out a signal that had come in from Earth on the deep channel, and the signal was an order. It was short. It had 11 words of preamble and 1 line of substance, and the line of substance authorized the Marigold to proceed to the Ashun system and to employ the thread. The thread, the weapon in her deep hull. The thing she had been built around, the reason her keel was 41 kilometers long, the reason she carried a reactor that could have run a small civilization, a lance that reached into a star and pulled, and made of it a thing that no longer supported life in any orbit for 11,000 years. Ashun, 4 billion people. The conquered's cradle, its heart, the world every conquered citizen still meant when they said home. The order was signed by the Consolidated Directorate of Earth. It said in the last line, and this line ran in text on 900 billion screens in 9 languages, while Sabine Hour's bridge crew stood in silence around her. End IT. She took 41 minutes. They were all in the file, every minute of them. Nobody on the Marigold had ever edited that record in 900 years, though there had been generations that wanted to, because it was not a heroic 41 minutes. It was an argument. The gunnery officer wanted to fire. He said so, and he gave his reasons, and his reasons were good, and they were these. Earth was dying under the blockade, the air was going, his own children were on it, and there would not be another chance, and the conquered had done to 11 worlds exactly what the Directorate was now ordering done to Ashun. He was not a monster. He was a father who had done arithmetic. The chief engineer wanted to fire. 2 of the department heads wanted to fire. Somebody at minute 19 said the sentence that would be quoted afterward on 900 worlds and taught in schools and carved, eventually, into a wall. They would not hesitate. Why should we be the only ones who hesitate? And Sabine Hour, 34 years old, hoarse, standing in a bridge that stank of burnt insulation with 11,000 of her own dead cooling in the compartments below her, said, "Because somebody has to be. That is all. That is the whole reason, and there is no better one, and I have been looking for a better one for 40 minutes. Somebody has to be the only one who hesitates, or it never stops. It just goes around and around until there is nobody left to hesitate at all. It might as well be us. We're already here." Then she said, "Thread stays cold." Then she said, in a voice that everybody in the Middle Reach would afterward agree was the voice of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing to herself, Log it as a refusal, not damage, not malfunction. A refusal, put my name on it. They'll want a name. And she turned the biggest weapon in the history of the galaxy away from 4 billion people and took it out into the dark. That was the 9 suns. The archive kept going, and this was the part that no one in the Middle Reach was prepared for, because they had assumed, for 1,000 years they had assumed, that the ossuary had gone out into the dark to grow, that it had been building, that every year of the silence had been a year of forging. The Marigold had gone out into the dark because Earth was hunting her. The Directorate declared her crew mutineers within 9 days. It sent what remained of the human fleet after her, the last 1,100 hulls that Earth had, the ships that might have made the difference somewhere, spent instead on chasing down the ship that would not burn a world. There was a running fight at the edge of the charts that lasted 4 years. Sabine Hour never fired on them. The record showed her running and running and running and hiding in dust and taking damage and burying her dead in the lake. And it showed her, in the 3rd year, refusing an offer of amnesty for herself alone. And it showed her, in the 4th year, dying of a wound she had taken in a compartment fire. And it showed what Earth did afterward. The long war ended 11 months later. It ended the way everyone in the Middle Reach knew it had ended. The human worlds fell, one after another, and the Directorate collapsed, and the Conquered and its allies took what was left. That was history. Every child knew it. What no child knew was the shape of the thing the Marigold's archive laid out with the cold patience of a ledger. That the human species had lost its last fleet chasing its own conscience across the dark, and that the people who spared Ashun were, in the end, the reason there had been no one left to defend the human worlds when the Conquered came. 30 generations of human dockhands and hull scrapers in the wet levels of 900 ports were the price of 41 minutes on a bridge that stank of burnt insulation. The archive said this plainly. That was the thing that broke people. It did not claim a rescue. It set out what the refusal had cost and who had paid for it, and noted that most of them had never been given a vote. And then it said in the last file in the boy's voice, in 9 languages, "We are not asking you to be grateful. Gratitude is a debt and we did not lend you anything. She turned the ship away because it was wrong, not because it was a trade. If you had never found out, that would have been all right too. That was the whole point of it, that it did not need to be seen. We are asking for something else, and we will tell you what it is, and then you can decide. But first, before anything, before we ask you for anything, there are 409,000 names, and we have all of them, and we have been keeping them for 900 years, and if you will let me, I would like to read them to you." And then Theodor Amsel began to read the names of the Conquered dead. He started at 700 ships' time. There were 409,000 of them, in the phonetics of 9 species, and he had spent 11 years learning to pronounce them properly. And he did not use a machine, because the listeners had decided a long time ago, in a town meeting, by vote, in the 6th century of the long running, that a machine reading a name is not the same as a person reading a name, and that this distinction was the only thing they had. He read for 9 hours. Then he drank water and slept for 4 and got up and read for 9 more. The white marks on the hull, the rows and rows and rows of small pale scratches that had given the ship its name in 900 systems. They were not tallies. The Marigold had come out of the 9 suns carrying the enemy's casualty lists, pulled off the wrecks, reconstructed from intercepts, hunted through the Conquered's own broadcasts for a decade afterward by listeners who had learned an alien language for no other reason. And a woman in the 2nd century of the long running, nobody remembered who first. The record was clear that she had asked permission and been told to please herself, had gone out onto the hull in a suit with a cutting tool, and started carving them into the armor. It had taken 400 years. Every name, cut by hand, into the skin of the thing that had killed them, by the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the people who had done it, on a ship where the entire population could have fit into one district of one city of the world they did not burn. It was not a tally. It was a headstone 41 kilometers long, and the Middle Reach had been looking at it on schoolroom walls for 1,000 years, and had seen exactly what it expected to see. Sen Provost Unhurried watched the file break over the Concord like weather. She watched it in her office in the deep stacks, with the vigil's 1,000 years racked around her, and she did what she had been trained for 40 years to do, which was to check. She pulled the Concord's own intercept logs from the 9 suns. They were there, and they had always been there, unremarkable, unclassified, and no one had ever cross-read them against anything, because why would you? She matched the timings. She matched the signal envelopes. She matched the Directorate's deep-channel transmission at 2152 against a fragment the Concord's own listening posts had caught and filed and never decrypted, and she ran it, and it decrypted in under a minute with a key that had been in the public archive since the 4th century. And it was true. All of it was true, and it had been sitting in her own building for 1,000 years, in a rack she could reach with her hand. Then she went and looked at the founder's file. The doors were coded to her rank and refused her, and she stood in front of them for a moment, 94 years old, a woman who had never in her life broken a regulation. And then she called the archive's fire suppression officer and told him there was smoke in the sealed stack, and that he was to open it under emergency authority. And he did, because she was the Sen Provost, and because she was a person no one had ever had a reason to doubt. The founder's file was 1 page. That was the thing she was never able to explain afterward, to the inquiry, to the historians, to anyone. 1,000 years of fleets, 9 centuries of attacks on every wage slip in 9 empires, a weapon in orbit that could kill a star system, 60 million people in the wet levels of 900 ports. 1 page. It was a debrief, dated 11 days after the 9 suns, of a Concord signals officer who had been aboard the flagship of the broken Grand Fleet and had survived, and who reported, under oath, before the first Concord, in the presence of witnesses whose names were on the founding charter of the Ashen State, that his post had intercepted and decrypted the Earth transmission at 2152, and had then tracked the human Dreadnought's course for 11 hours, and had watched it hold at the edge of the Ashen approach with its main lance charged and its aperture open, in weapons lock, for 41 minutes, and then power down, and leave. At the bottom of the page, in the tight formal hand of a clerk who had been dead for 1,000 years, was the resolution of the first Concord, and it was 4 lines long, and Unhurried read it standing up, in the cold of the sealed stack, and then she read it again sitting on the floor. The first Concord had voted, 11-4, that the intercept and the debrief be sealed permanently. The reasoning was recorded. That was the Concord for you. The Concord recorded everything. The reasoning was that a people who believed they had been spared would ask why and would go looking, and would find in the answer an obligation. That an obligation to a monster is intolerable. That the war was not over and the Grand Fleet was gone, and the population would need a reason to pay for a new one. And there was no reason in the galaxy so cheap and so durable as a thing in the dark that keeps a tally of your dead. And the last line, which she would read out 4 days later in front of the assembled parliaments of 9 empires, with her voice absolutely steady. Let it be a monster. A monster costs US nothing and buys US everything. A debt would cost US ourselves. Unhurried sat on the floor of the sealed stack with 1 page in her hand. Above her, 4 light towers out. 31,000 hulls of the standing answer held their firing solution on a 41-kilometer headstone that was reading the names of their dead in a boy's voice, hour after hour, into every band in the Middle Reach. And on the 4th day of the reading, at the 11th hour, with 200,000 names still to go, Marshal doth Corin of the Pale Houses of Gora, who had commanded the vigil for 19 years, who had inherited the command from his mother, who had built his entire life and the entire meaning of his house upon the certainty that one day the thing in the picture would come back and he would be the man who stopped it. Declared the transmission a hostile psychological operation under Article 9 of the Vigil Protocol, assumed emergency command of the standing answer, and gave the order to fire. The standing answer had spent 900 years rehearsing this. It fired beautifully. That was the obscene thing about it. 9 empires who could not agree on a trade tariff, whose parliaments had come to blows over fishing rights within living memory, laid 31,000 hulls into a single converging solution, and opened up in a sequence so clean it looked, on the plot, like something growing. At the receiving end of it, the Marigold did nothing at all. She did not roll. She did not spread her signature. She did not launch a single one of the 11,000 countermeasures still racked in her forward tubes, because the countermeasures had been welded shut 9 years before departure by a vote of the town meeting, and the welds were checked weekly, and there was a woman whose entire job it was to check them, and on the 26th day she was at her post checking them when the first salvo arrived. 41 kilometers of armor from an aged nobody could build in any more. It held. For 11 minutes it simply held, and in the fleet there was a kind of horror in that, because the gunners of the standing answer had been raised on the certainty that the Ossuary would be hard to kill, and it is one thing to be told a thing, and another to watch your entire life's work strike a wall and slide off it. Then the armor started to go. Deck by deck. The Marigold had been designed to take punishment, and she took it, and the way a ship that size takes punishment is that it dies in pieces over hours, and each piece is a place where people worked. Bay 9, which was B's, opened to vacuum in the 4th hour. Bay 11, which was wheat, burned for 2 days. The fire suppression had been cannibalized in the 6th century for parts. The lake boiled off through a breach in the ventral hull and became, for 11 minutes, the most beautiful thing anyone in the standing answer had ever seen. 180 meters of black water flashing to vapor and freezing, a plume of white crystal 10 kilometers long, catching the light of ashen sun, with the ashes of 40 generations of the human dead going out into the dark inside it. 900 billion people watched that on their screens. Nobody had told them what it was. Ihru Vantesh, watching it from the floor of a sealed stack with one page in her hand, knew exactly what it was, and made a sound she was ashamed of afterward. And through all of it, on every band in the middle reach, the reading did not stop. Theodor Amsel read for 9 hours and slept for 4 and got up and read for 9 more. The listening deck lost pressure in the 11th hour of the bombardment, and they moved him down to a lower compartment, and he was reading while they carried the console. When the power fluctuated and the synthesizer for the Ilm phonemes failed, he did the Ilm phonemes himself, badly, and apologized for it on air to 900 billion people in the middle of being shot. "I'm sorry. That was wrong. Their names should be said properly, and I'm getting them wrong, and I'll try again." He got to 200,000, then 150, then 100. Somewhere around the 80th thousand, the first Ilm gunnery crew stopped firing. It was not a mutiny. Nobody in the Ilm Dominion ever called it that, and the court that convened afterward was very careful with the word. It was a crew of 11 on a light cruiser, and their fire control officer simply took her hands off the board and sat with them in her lap, and when her captain asked her what she thought she was doing, she said that the boy had just read the name of her husband's great-grandmother's grandmother correctly in the old coastal dialect that nobody spoke anymore, and that she had not known that name was written down anywhere in the universe, and that she found she could not. Her captain sat with that for a while, then he took his hands off his board too. By the 9th hour of the bombardment there were 400 ships in the standing answer that had gone quiet. By the 14th there were 3,000. They did not turn on the others. They did not signal. They simply stopped, one crew at a time, and hung there in the dark with their guns cold, watching the wall of names come apart. And on Ashun in the great hall of the conquered, 94 years old, in a plain coat, without an appointment, Sen Provost Ihru Vantesh walked into a joint emergency session of 9 parliaments and put 1 page on the lectern. She did not read the intercept first. She had thought about that for a long time on the walk over, and she had decided that the intercept was not the crime. Everyone already had the intercept. The boy had given it to them free. So she read the 4 lines of the first Concord's resolution, in the founding hand, dated 11 days after the 9 sons, and she read the last one twice. Let it be a monster. A monster costs us nothing and buys us everything. A debt would cost us ourselves. She put the page down. That is the foundation of this state, she said, in the silence. Not the 9 sons. This. Our great-grandmothers were told the truth by an honest signals officer 11 days after the battle, and they voted 11-4 to lock it in a drawer, and they built us a fleet and a tax and a schoolroom picture on top of the drawer, and every one of you in this room has spent your life standing on it. Somebody out there is reading our dead to us, correctly, in the old dialects. He has been doing it for 4 days while we shoot him. We are not defending ourselves. We have not been defending ourselves for 1,000 years. We have been protecting an invoice. It went out live. Of course it went out live. It was a joint emergency session, and the Concord recorded everything, and that was the Concord for you. In the wet levels and the lower rings of 900 ports, 60 million people who had spent 30 generations being told what their ancestors were stood absolutely still. They had been listening for 4 days. Of course they had. They had listened in the sump galleries and the scrap yards and the freight elevators, on handsets and cargo repeaters, and the ancient tinny speakers bolted into the ceilings of the labor dormitories. And they had listened to a boy their own age read 400,000 alien names in 9 languages, and not one name of their own. There was a thing they had not understood until that moment, and now they did, and it went through 60 million people in about 9 hours, and no government in the Middle Reach saw it coming because no government in the Middle Reach had ever thought to ask a hull scraper what she believed. They had been told, all their lives, that their people had lost the long war because they were weak. They had not lost it because they were weak. They had lost it because, on one night in one bridge that stank of burnt insulation, with 4 billion strangers in the crosshairs, their great-grandmothers had been asked to become the thing they were fighting, and had said no, and had gone on saying no for 4 years while their own species hunted them for it, and had died of it, and had never told anybody, and had never asked for so much as a word. That is a very different thing to be the descendant of. The reports out of the labor quarters in those 9 hours are strange reading, and the historians have never known quite what to do with them because nothing happened. There were no riots. There was no sabotage. The night shifts went to work. But the Concord's own internal survey, taken 11 days later in a state of some confusion, found the same answer given, in slightly different words, in 109 ports. We always knew there was a reason. We didn't know what it was. We just knew there was one. Marshal Duthcoren, 4 light towers out, aboard the flagship of the Pale Houses, saw the parliaments break and understood, with the clarity of a man watching the floor of his own house tilt, that he had less than an hour left in which the order he was about to give would still be legal. He was 51. He had commanded the vigil for 19 years and had inherited it from his mother, who had inherited it from hers. His house had held the 9th seat of the Vigil Council since the founding. Everything he had, everything his line had, everything the Pale Houses of Gora were in the councils of 9 empires, rested on one proposition, that the thing in the picture was coming back, and that the Pale Houses would be standing between it and everyone else when it did. He had not lied about that. That was the thing the histories would find hardest to be fair about. Duthcoren had believed it with his whole heart, every day of his life, and he had been good, And he had been ready. And he had been ready for 19 years, and now a 19-year-old boy with a bad accent in Ilm was reading names on every channel in the Middle Reach, and taking it all away from him, gently, without ever once raising his voice. There is a particular cruelty in being spared by someone you were about to kill. It leaves you nothing to be. He gave the order to the Ember. The Ember had never been fired. It had been inspected daily for 900 years and blessed monthly in 4 faiths, and its firing authority sat with the Marshal of the Vigil under Article 9, and Duth Corin's authentication was accepted by the machine in 11 seconds, because a machine does not read parliaments. His flag captain flagged the beam path. That was in the record too afterward. It was flagged clearly. It was flagged in the loudest way a subordinate is permitted to flag anything, and the flag captain's exact words were entered into evidence. "Sir, the target is on the threshold line." The vantage threshold. The great civilian anchorage, 11 light minutes beyond the Marigold on precisely that vector. A transit ring the size of a small moon. The crossroads of the Middle Reach. 2 million souls on it on any given day. And on this given day, rather more than that, because for 26 days the Concord's emergency measures had been quietly moving human labor populations out of the lower rings of the inner worlds and warehousing them somewhere secure, and somewhere secure had turned out, in the way these things always turn out, to mean the threshold. 61,000 human beings. Dockhands, hull scrapers, sump divers. Children. The modeling said the ossuary would absorb the discharge completely. The modeling had always said that. The modeling was the reason the Ember had been built at that yield in the first place. Duth Corin looked at the flag and at the plot, and at the wall of names coming apart, and at 19 years, and he said, "The modeling holds. Fire." Aboard the Marigold, the alarm that sounded was one that no living human being had ever heard, because it had not been used since the Long War, and everybody knew what it was anyway, the way you know a sound you were taught as a child. Sorrel Cole was in the lower compartment, standing behind Tio, when the Wrights called it up. 11 minutes, stellar scale lance, vector fixed. And the drive, the ruined, splinted, 90-year degrading drive, with 3,100 people still in the compartments around it who could not be moved, had enough left in her for one thing. Exactly one. The Wrights were very clear, and they were the sort of people who were never anything else. The Marigold could skew off the line. Not far. Enough. She was hurt and she was slow and she was 41 kilometers of dying metal, but she could move that much. And if she moved that much, the lance would pass her, and she would live, in the way she was already living, which was to say for another year or two before the lattice let go. And the lance would go on, and 11 light minutes further down that clean fixed line was the vantage threshold. Nobody argued. That was the thing Tio remembered, afterward, all his life, more than the light and more than the sound. He had grown up in a ship that argued about everything, that had spent 9 months arguing about whether to come home at all, that had voted 411 votes out of 29,000, and in the 11 minutes that were left, nobody argued. Sorrel Cole said, "Hold her steady." And the Wrights said, "Aye." And that was all. Tio turned back to the microphone. His hands were shaking so badly that he had to put them flat on the table. There were 91,000 names left to read, and he was not going to get to them. And there was one thing he had not said yet. One thing the ship had carried across 11 light years and 900 years, and had been saving for a moment when somebody might actually be listening. And he understood, the way you understand things at 19, all at once, too late and exactly on time, that this was the moment, that there was not going to be another one. He opened every band in the Middle Reach. "This is Marigold," he said. "There's a weapon coming. It's on a line that goes through us and then through the vantage threshold, and there are 2 million people on the threshold, and about 60,000 of them are ours, so please believe me when I say we have checked the numbers." We can move. We've been told we can move. We aren't going to. I want to say the thing we came here to say, because I don't think I'll get another go at it. We didn't come for revenge. We didn't come for reparations. We didn't come to make you feel anything at all about a battle that happened 1,000 years ago to people we never met. We came to ask for a planet. There's a world in your registry. You call it Memorial Object 1. It's sterile, the air died about 900 years ago, and nothing's grown on it since, and you keep it sealed and you run tour flights twice a year, and I've heard the tour narration. I've heard it hundreds of times. It comes through on the Karen Leisure Channel, and it's very well written. It's called Earth. Nobody wants it. It costs you money. It's a dead rock with a nice view and a gift shop. We have the seed, all of it. It's in Bay 4, and it's the last of it in the universe. Every crop, every tree, every grass, the fungi and the bacteria, and the whole boring invisible engine that makes a world work. And we have kept it alive for 900 years in a magazine that used to hold ammunition. And we've spent 40 generations learning how to put it back. That's what we want. That's the whole of it. Give us the dead one. Let us go home and try. You don't owe us. She didn't turn the ship away so that anybody would owe us. She turned it away because it was wrong, and it cost us everything, and we would do it again. And that is not a threat. It has never once been a threat. We have been carrying your names on our hull for 400 years. The compartment lurched. Somewhere aft, something enormous gave way. I'm sorry, said Teodor Amsel, 19 years old, in the trade tongue of the Ashun Conquered, with the vowels a little long, the way a person speaks a language they have learned entirely from listening. I'm sorry. There are 91,000 names left, and I'm not going to finish. Somebody else will have to. Please finish them. Please finish them, and please plant our world, and please don't be frightened of us anymore. We were never the thing on your wall. We were just people who were very far away and could not come home. 11 minutes later, the Ember fired. There is no good way to describe what a stellar-scale lance does to a ship, and the people who tried afterward mostly gave up and used the recordings instead. The Marigold held her line. She did not roll, and she did not skew, and she did not raise a shield she did not have. And for the last 4 seconds before the discharge arrived, she was simply what she had always been, 41 kilometers of dark armor with 409,000 names cut into it by hand, holding still in the dark between a weapon and a crowd. The Ember struck her 140 meters after the midship's frame. It went through her the way light goes through smoke. The aft 2/3 of the ship, the drive halls, the engineering spine, the great cold hollow where the lake had been, the compartments where the 3,100 people who could not be moved were standing at their posts with their hands on boards they had inherited from their mothers, ceased, in the space of 1/5 of a second, to be matter arranged in any particular way. And the beam ended there. That was the thing the physicists of 9 empires would spend the next 40 years arguing about, and never entirely settle, and the closest they came was this. The Ember had been designed to unmake a thing, and the Marigold had not tried to survive it, and a lance calibrated against a target that dodges behaves differently against a target that opens its arms. She took the whole discharge into her own mass and her own ruin. She ate it. The forward third of her came out the other side of the light, burning and blind and turning slowly end over end. And behind her, 11 light minutes down a clean fixed line, 2 million people on the vantage threshold stood at the windows and watched a star go out and did not know yet that it had been standing in front of them. The standing answer did not fire again. Not one ship, not one gun. 31,000 hulls hung in the dark with their solution still locked and did absolutely nothing, and the silence on the fleet channels went on for 11 seconds, which is a very long time in a war, and then it broke, and what broke it was not an order. It was a Bell corvette skipper, 400 kilometers off the Marigold's bow, who put her helm over and went in. She had no orders. She was in violation of about 9 articles. Her ship had a crew of 40 and a medical bay meant for 6, and she went into a debris field that was still incandescent and still shedding hull plating the size of city blocks, and she came out of it 11 minutes later with 209 human beings crammed into every compartment she had, including her own cabin, including the passages, and she went back in, and she did it 4 more times. By then there were 900 ships going in. By the end of the first day, there were 11,000. They came from every empire in the Middle Reach, Ilm cruisers, Charon freighters, conquered assault carriers designed for a boarding action they had drilled for 900 years and now used backward to take people off, Pale House's destroyers whose crews had been shooting at the wreck 4 hours earlier, and who now flew into the fire ahead of everyone because there is no engine in the universe like shame. They cut through the armor. They cut through the names. There was a Decelerating cutting crew who found themselves burning a hole through the letters of a name they recognized, and stopped, and one of them, this is in the record, it was on their helmet feed, it went everywhere, put his hand flat against the letters for a second before he cut. Of the 30,000 people aboard the Marigold, 21,411 were taken off alive. The rest are on the wall now with the others. They found Theodor Amsel on the 4th day, in a compartment 3 decks below the ruined listening deck, in a suit with 11 hours of air left in it and 9 hours already gone. He was unconscious, and his left arm was broken in 2 places, and he was still holding, in the crook of the other, a hard-shelled case that turned out to contain the reading list. 409,000 names, printed on paper, because a listener in the 6th century had argued in town meeting that anything that mattered should exist somewhere that could not lose power. 91,000 of them were still unread. Captain Sorrow Cole was not found. She had been in the lower compartment when the frame went, and the lower compartment had been on the wrong side of the break, and the last thing she is recorded as saying on an open channel to the rights in a perfectly level voice was, "Hold her steady." Marshal Duth Corin was arrested by his own flag captain 19 minutes after the Ember fired. He did not resist. He was taken back to Gora in his own ship, and the Pale Houses, who had held the 9th seat of the Vigil Council since the founding, and who understood before anyone else that the 9th seat no longer existed, tried him themselves publicly in a hall they opened to the broadcasts of all 9 empires, because there was nothing left to protect, and they knew it. The charge carried death. It had always carried death. And on the 11th day of the trial, from a conquered hospital ship where he was recovering from a broken arm, and a lung he would never entirely get back, a 19-year-old boy with no rank, no office and no standing in any court of the Middle Reach asked to submit a statement, and the Pale Houses, who had by then stopped being able to refuse the Marigold anything, allowed it. It was 4 sentences long. He believed us. That is all he did wrong. He believed exactly what you all taught him, and he believed it harder than anyone, and he was the only one of you who never once got a chance to hear us before he had to decide. If you kill him for that, then the picture on your wall was right, and my captain died for nothing, and everything my grandmother said in that hall was a lie. Do not kill him, make him read the names. There are 91,000 left, and I cannot finish them, and I am told that he is a man of great persistence. They commuted it. Duth Corin served 11 years, and read for 9 of them, and finished the list in the 4th year of his sentence, and asked, on his own authority and at his own expense, to begin again from the first name, properly in the old dialects, because the first time through he had been getting the coastal Ilm phonemes wrong. He is buried on Gora. He asked for no monument, and the Pale Houses gave him none, which is what he wanted, and there is a small unmarked plot in the north of the capital where people leave, for reasons nobody has ever adequately explained, marigolds. Sen Provost Ihru Vantesh resigned in the autumn. She was not required to. There was, in fact, an enormous and slightly hysterical effort across 4 empires to prevent it, because she had become, in the space of a season, the only official in the Middle Reach that anybody trusted. And there were people who wanted to make her first minister, and people who wanted to put her face on the currency, and one delegation from the Bel Septarchy who wanted, sincerely, to make her a minor deity. And she declined all of it in the same 4-line letter. She had not been brave, she wrote. She had been slow. It had taken her 40 years and 4,000 dead to open a door that had never been locked, only labeled, and a state that hands out honors for that is a state that has learned nothing. Then she asked to be allowed to work, and they asked her what work, and she told them. She spent the last 11 years of her life in the archive of a dead world, in a prefabricated hut in the gray dust beside a broken hull, cross-indexing 900 years of a human town's records, its harvests, its quarrels, its town meetings, the minutes of the 9 months in which it had argued about whether to come home, against the intercept logs of the Ashun Conquered, so that the two histories, which had been the same history all along, could be read side by anyone who wanted to. She is buried there. That was her request, and it was granted without debate, and she lies under the 7th hectare of the first grass, which had not yet grown when they put her in it. Theodor Amsel spoke at her funeral. He was 26, and it was the second time in his life he had spoken in public, and it was 11 words long. She was the only one of them who kept checking. That's all, that's the whole of it. The vigil was dissolved by joint act of 9 parliaments in the spring of the following year. 31,000 hulls were struck from the lists. The levy, Vig, 1,000 years of it on every wage slip in 900 systems was ended, and the last collection of it, by a piece of parliamentary theater that Ihru Vantesh proposed and afterward said she was not entirely proud of, was spent in a single-line item. Tugs. Because there was still the forward third of a warship out there, 40 generations of gardens, a broken spine, a hull covered in names, and no engine at all. It took 9 months to move her. 11 light years, at a crawl, in a cradle of 1,100 vessels drawn from every navy in the Middle Reach, and every one of them under the command of civilian salvage masters, and every one of them flying a flag that had been designed by a committee of 9 empires in 9 days and looked, everyone agreed, absolutely terrible. They took her slowly, they had to. The Wrights who were left rode her hull the whole way, in suits, in shifts, welding and shoring and swearing at her, and the alien crews came out and worked beside them. And by the 4th month there were conquered shipwrights and Ilm structural engineers and Charon riggers who could speak enough of the Marigold's dialect to argue in it, which they did, constantly, because the Marigold's people argued about everything and always had. And on a morning in the 9th month, the tugs cut their cables, and the forward third of the human Dreadnought Marigold, 9 kilometers of ruined armor, gardens, an orchard, and a magazine full of seed, came down through the atmosphere of a dead world for the first time in 1,000 years. The Conquered had cleared the registry entry the previous autumn. Memorial Object 1, delisted. The clerk who processed it was 23 and did not think much about it at the time and has since been interviewed 400 times. She came down over a continent that had been called Europe, and she came down slowly, on lifting drives that 1,100 people had spent 9 months rebuilding out of parts scavenged from 4 species navies, and she was not graceful, and she was not beautiful, and she left a scar 4 kilometers long in a plain of gray dust, where nothing had grown since before the Conquered had a parliament. And she stopped, and the hull opened, and what came out was not weapons. It was people carrying trees. Theodor Amsel was 20 by then. He came out with the 3rd group, because there had been an argument about the order and he had lost it, and he was carrying a crate of apple stock from Bay 4 with his good arm and swearing at the weight of it, and he walked 6 steps down the ramp, and then he stopped, because he had come to the end of the ramp, and there was nothing under his feet but the world. He stood on the ground. He stood on it for a long time. There was a great deal of noise behind him. 21,000 people and 1,100 ships and 4 alien navies, and the whole enormous clattering business of putting a species back on a planet, and none of it reached him at all. He had never in his life seen a horizon that did not curve up and become a ceiling. The sky over him was the color of nothing at all, a thin, dirty gray with no weather in it, the sky of a world that had been dead for 9 centuries. And it was, without any argument, the most beautiful thing that anyone on that ship had ever seen, and he was not the only one on his knees. The work took a long time. It is still taking a long time. It will take longer than anyone alive. You do not restart a world in a year or a decade or a lifetime. You begin the bacteria and you wait, and you begin the fungi and you wait, and the numbers are measured in centuries, and the people who do it know that they are doing it for strangers. They had 900 years of practice at that. The bees went out in the 4th year. The first grass took in the 7th, in a valley in the north, 60 hectares of it, and it is a matter of record that when the report came in, 4 alien governments closed their offices for the day and nobody had planned it and nobody had asked. And in the 11th year, on a morning in what the old calendars called April, it rained. Not much, not for long. A thin, mean, unimpressive rain out of a thin, unimpressive sky, over 60 hectares of grass in a valley in the north, and it lasted 19 minutes. Theodor Amsel was 30. He walked out into it with his hands open, along with about 4,000 other people and a great many aliens who had come a long way to stand in the mud, and he did not say anything, because he had said everything he had. He had spent 11 years learning to say one thing well, and he had said it while being shot, and there was nothing to add. The hull is still there. 9 kilometers of it, lying in the gray dust at the edge of a valley that is not gray anymore, with a scar 4 kilometers long behind it, and they have not cut it up, and they will not, and there was never a vote about it because nobody thought a vote was necessary. It is a wall now, that is what people call it. 409,000 names cut into armor by hand over 400 years by the children of the people who made them dead, and beneath them, added since, on plates fixed to the hull by 9 empires shipwrights working together and arguing constantly, 11,000 more from the 9 suns, and 3,100 from the last day, and 1 line at the bottom in the old naval hand, with no rank and no title, because she had abandoned insignia as a waste of thread. Ossuary Cole, she held her steady. They come from 900 systems to see it. There is no gift shop. There is a path through the grass, and it takes about 4 hours to walk the length of the wall, and most people do not finish. 1,000 years, the empires waited for the monster to come back. They built a fleet for it and a weapon for it and a tax for it, and they put its picture on the wall of every schoolroom in the Middle Reach. And when at last it came out of the dark, decelerating, patient, unhurried, 41 kilometers of armor scored with what they had always believed was a tally of their dead. Every empire braced for the end of the world. What came instead was a boy's voice on every band in the sky, saying please. What came was the truth, and the truth was harder than the legend and worse and better, that they had been spared once by someone who paid for it with everything, and that they had known and had sealed it in a drawer, and had built 1,000 years of iron on top of it rather than owe a debt. They had feared the worst for 1,000 years. The worst had already happened. It had happened 11 days after the 9 suns, in a quiet room, in a vote of 11 to 4, and the monster had had nothing to do with it. And the thing they had been so frightened of turned out to be a farm.